Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Morais, your host and moderator. This program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with the law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to help yourself, your family, and your business. We provide information and resources that'll help you decide whether or not you actually may be able to handle some issues yourself. If you do need professional counsel, hopefully they will be better prepared and you will receive better results. That's our goal, that you'd save time, money, and achieve better results. The Bazaar and Associates Law Firm in East Providence continue to help us with the various topics that we will tackle, and once again we want to welcome and thank David Bazaar.
Thank you, Deb.
So, happy holidays, and today our topic is many happy returns. We hope you have them. So that's certainly been a contentious issue of late. Millions of Americans are heading to the malls and shopping centers once again to save on various purchases and sales that are available, but also to return many unwanted gifts. So apparently about 10% of all holiday merchandise ends up back in the stores. That's according to the National Retail Foundation, and it's a $60 billion hit. Not surprisingly, there are many reports now about who has the best and the worst policies. We're going to cover some of those today. So some of the highlights, for example, Macy's requires all returns to be within 1 year. Others may be just a matter of a few days, and that's changed based on whether they're electronics or perhaps even if it's a major appliance. So, for the news from the business side that we will cover today, perhaps you may need to know that there are many businesses that end up having to deal with people who are acting fraudulently. That's a shame. We'll cover that too. So we want to first tell you, if you need to follow up on this, findlaw.com, under customer returns and fraud and refunds lost by state listed so that you can find specific information. So, David, what happens in general about refund policies? Stores do it all the time.
So every state has its own laws on what a store at a minimum has to do. Rhode Island, for example, unless it's posted somewhere before you buy the product, all sales are final or no returns or whatever the case might be, most items have to be, you have to be allowed to be able to return them within 10 days after the time you purchased it, so long as you have the sales certificate or some other form receipt from the store showing that you bought it there. And there are some exceptions to that rule. Books, magazines, food, perishable items, those types of things are not covered by that law. But an unused, unopened item can be returned. Now, I had a client who called me up and said, you know, he bought edible underwear for his girlfriend. They broke up. Can I return it? And I said, I don't know, that may fall under the food category. But seriously, you have to look at what it is and what items are involved in the thing. And then what happens is each store is allowed to create their own policies as long as they're at least as favorable as the law requires. So you have to know, and all of this has to be posted at the point of sale or somewhere in the store when you come in or someplace before you actually buy the product. So if you have the information on the sales receipt, the store hasn't met its obligation because that's after you buy it that you get the sales receipt. So those are all the key factors that go into some of this.
Of course, there are so many more wrinkles now, we'll get into some of them, but if you happen to be buying online, there's not a point of purchase or at the cash register sign that can be posted, and where people end up posting that information is in the mouse print, better known as 4-point, at the end of some back page that no one looks at.
Right.
So that ends up becoming a sticky wicket. As I was researching this topic, and I don't really mean this to be a trick question, but it is. Are returns a right or a privilege? What would you say to that, David?
Well, based on the fact that there's a law that says you have a right to return certain items, it's a right. That right, however, can be curtailed, and there are a number of ways that that can happen. For example, you might have something that's marked final sale.
Yes.
You can't return it.
As is,
As
whatever.
is. So those types of things, your right is limited. So although it can be a right, it becomes a privilege in the sense that a store, out of good faith, wanting to have you as a customer, might extend the rules that the state requires them to give. So there are some online companies, for example, that have very extensive return policies and satisfaction guaranteed and all those types of things. So those actually become privileges in that sense.
It was interesting. The first thing that I read is that it is the returns and exchanges are courtesies, with the exception. This was loosely written, of course, except for whether or not whether there's damaged merchandise, and then they're beholden to take that back. Of course, whether it's damaged or whether someone broke it, as we've read of late, some people actually break something and then return it. This is out and out fraud, but gone undetected. How do you prove it? And some have these very lenient policies. While it's very nice for a store to do this, now they're in a very untenable and unprofitable situation.
Right.
These stores.
Of course, you have those issues of fraud, and it's hard to guard against that. And it really sort of impinges upon the rights of other people who do buy something that is legitimately defective at the time they buy it. And the law in most states, and then of course there's federal law that can get involved in some of this, and you start delving into warranties and breach of warranty and implied and express warranties and the differences between all of that. But even where something like in Massachusetts might be on sale with a sign, all sales final, it really has to say except for defective merchandise, because you do have a right to return defective merchandise.
But some of those as is have a little wrinkle here or a string pulled there or a button missing there. Does that qualify as defective merchandise, so you shouldn't plan on taking it and then buying it and then taking it back?
No, I don't think that would qualify as is sold, where you're buying something that might have been a display item or something that has obvious defects. I'm thinking of a number of different circumstances that I've been involved with where, for example, you buy a used boat as is. There might be some damage to the gel coat. You know that when you buy it as is for that very reason, as opposed to a brand new boat that might have that same damage to it. If it wasn't a display model or something like that, then you can expect it to be repaired because it shouldn't have had that defect. And now remember, a defective product, there's a number of options that the retailer has. Repair, replace, refund, I guess. Those would be the three.
Those, yes.
So if it's a slight defect to something, then they'd have the right to repair it. If you bought a brand new coat not as is, that has a button missing, then they'd simply have to replace the button. If it was a coat that had a run in color that couldn't be repaired, but they certainly could replace it, they might have the right to do that. You know, if they didn't have the item to replace it, they'd have to refund the money.
That's all considered very good customer service if you're handling it properly.
And of course, a lot of what stores will do depend on the retailer's customer service policies and their desire to make their customers happy.
And most should, of course. So you had mentioned earlier the federal law. Apparently there's something that's referred to as a cooling off rule, and I assume that's not just about retailing, but anything. If you buy something, you have a grace period to deal with that cognitive dissonance or buyer's remorse or whatever they call it. So it's 3 days in some cases and 10 in others. That's at the state level, though, right?
Right. So most states do have some rules on that. 3 days is a common number of days to change your mind on a lot of different things, and it really runs the gamut. We're talking mostly here about buying products, so we're really dealing with that type of thing. You buy a used car, usually you have a 3-day right of rescission, so to speak, to return the car. Yeah, this doesn't really meet the needs of what I wanted, and so you can do that. But it goes across a lot of different things. When you refinance a home, for example, there's a 3-day right of rescission in that type of transaction too. So you can say, no, I want to pull the plug on this. The interest rates are just not where I thought they would be, that type of thing. So the cooling off period, the 3 days, 10 days, really depends on the type of transaction that's involved.
And now, apart from the retail bricks and mortar stores, when people are buying things that are digital, they have a software application. Many, before they sell it, will give you a little bit of a demo. The longer or more extensive the demo, perhaps you might reason that that means you're more familiar with the product. Maybe that means that that seller no longer has to give you a full refund after you've tried it for 30 days, you've seen the demo, now you download it, you paid for it. Is the manufacturer or whoever the seller is he required to give you the entire refund back after 3 days? There's no restocking fee, there's no...
Right.
How do they deal with that?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I'm not 100% sure on the software media market, if there's a way, if you want to return it, that they can stop you from using it if it's already been downloaded and that type of thing. I don't know how that works, but I would assume the rules are fairly consistent in terms of what they have to do. I just don't know specifically with software how that might work.
It makes sense, of course, that if it's a defective, not working, not functioning, they would have to do something.
Right.
And I know, as you always say, buyer beware, you're supposed to always read the fine print. But when it comes to the online purchases that are made, those return policies and privacy policies, they need to be stated, but they're in, as I said, the back pages in mouse print and in the crush of this holiday season. I wonder how many people actually look at that, even though they want the returns later.
Not many.
Not many.
I can guarantee you that most people don't. So that's why it's important to know who you're dealing with as your online vendor, so to speak. There's a number of very reputable companies that have very liberal policies on returns and making sure that their customer service is as good as anybody's.
And I guess another element of that, when you were talking about, of course, each company has its own way of handling things, and certainly no one expects you to know each and every policy, but many of these products that are applications have problems with them, and you said repair or replace or whatever. The digital equivalent often is a downloadable patch or fix or something that means, no, you're not getting your money back, but we will fix it and make sure that it's bug-free or,
Right.
if not entirely flawless.
So that sort of comes under what we talked about as far as the defective merchandise and the repair, replace, refund. That's the repair. And if they're able to fix it, I think they have the right to do that.
What do you think, and maybe this is a little bit rhetorical, but when you go to a brick and mortar store, you can touch the merchandise, you can feel it, you can examine it, you can see if there's something that's not correct in it. But when it comes to buying something that's online, you can't feel it, you can't touch it. Does that mean that more than likely an online policy should be more liberal, considering you couldn't have seen whether it fit, whether it had some dye problem?
Right. I think that's why they do have, many of the vendors online do have a more liberal policy about you get it, you have a right to examine it, and a right to return it. Some of them even will cover the shipping cost of returning it. And there's a cost of doing business, as you talked about with some of these other things. But if I'm buying jewelry online, and a lot of people are doing that nowadays more and more, if it's not exactly what I thought it was when I got it, and I know I can return it, I'm more likely to go ahead with that purchase. And
Yes.
so most of these online jewelry companies will stand behind their product in that sense. So it gives the consumer some comfort to know that I have a right under this vendor's policy. So you have to know what vendor you're dealing with to be able to return something.
Interesting. Well, you should obviously check things before you buy, check out what the store's policies are. Right after the holiday, all of the major news organizations were issuing stories or videos or some sort of segments about the 10 best, the 10 worst retail stores and who you should consider doing business with. It was interesting that once upon a time, it was just LL Bean that took back anything, anytime, under any circumstance. And yet now we see that Nordstrom's is considered a gold standard, as is, this is the 10 best, Nordstrom's, as is LL Bean's. They even say Macy's, some of these big box stores, even Costco, who sells from kayaks to cucumbers, as they refer to their stuff. They are being very lenient. Does that make sense from a standpoint of the merchant as well as the buyer?
It does. And again, it's because buying online. And so the ones that are selling, what did you say, kayaks to cucumbers?
Kayaks to cucumbers
Yeah.
is Costco.
So I think it's a little bit different if you're buying a TV, that you know what you're buying. It's exactly something you can research and study, and you actually don't have to go into a store to know exactly what it is because you know what you're buying, as opposed to pearls.com, which has adopted that same return policy. But you go on and you buy pearls, and you have an idea of what you're buying, and the pictures are pretty good and all of that. But in order to make sure that their customers are completely satisfied, they have that right of return. And so Macy's, Kohl's, JCPenney, all of these companies that do that are operating under the good faith agreement with their customer that we are selling this to you sort of sight unseen in a sense.
Yes.
You get the right to see it, and if it's not exactly what we represented it to be, or at least what you thought it was, you can return it. That makes sense in a lot of areas. I think it's a little generous in areas where you really do know what you're buying.
Correct.
And some stores still do that.
And to your point, so for example, Zappos, which is zappos.com that most people were familiar with, they are one of the 10 best, and it says you don't need to worry about buying the wrong fitting shoes online because anytime, any place, they'll take them back. They give you 365 days, which is certainly a very extended refund period. And at that same time, there are many of these that are listed that say up to a year. Doesn't that just encourage fraud?
Yeah.
If you're using something for 365 days and on the 364th you say, gee, I think I'm going to take this back, that seems excessive and abusive.
It does. It's a little bit against the intent of what they're trying to do. How do you guard against that? I don't know that you really can, except it's supposed to be return unused. Of course, how do you know? I mean, shoes you might know, but jewelry, how would you know? And it's, you know, there are companies now that actually make a business out of that. They'll rent you the dress instead of buying the dress. So.
Well, that sounds very legitimate. And the other side of that is stores such as Nordstrom's and Bloomingdale's, who are the upper rankings of among women's apparel, their special occasion dresses, they say now that they may only give you 30 days or 60 days. But how many people, as I've read, have worn the dress, kept the tag on, tucked it in the back, the week later, the day later, took it back and said, I'm not satisfied with it, or it doesn't fit, or whatever their complaint is, or whatever the concern is, but and they're taking it back.
Yeah, and so it adds cost to everybody else, so that's sort of unfair, but the stores have to adjust their policies accordingly. So it's interesting. They might give a longer period of time for some things and a shorter period of time for others, and that makes sense, and it's sort of what I'm saying. And again, it all falls in, they have to only do what the law requires. And most of these stores, especially online, tend to do more than they're required to do as a customer service relationship building type of thing.
And to remain competitive, of course.
Right.
I can tell you a very interesting example. So when there's this listing of Macy's and Costco and Zappos and Athleta, which is part of Gap, and Kohl's, Target, all considered to be among the top 10, once upon a time, the big box then store called Sears, when it was located in Rhode Island Mall, a former retailing tenant had spoken to the general manager of Sears, who said, of course we take anything back anytime. And his point was the average consumer who really frequents and uses our store may spend $20,000 a year. Of course, we're going to take anything back anytime because we wouldn't want to sacrifice that good relationship for the sake of one item. Now, fast forward 40 years or whatever it is, no longer is Sears the only big box store that was all-inclusive. And so now, as we read it, they end up being on the list of 10 worst. They don't hold the same position, and I'm sure they're not getting the $20,000 per customer because people may easily go upper or lower, Walmart to wherever else they might go to get what they need. But certainly their standing in the community, I'm sure, has changed too as a result of that. If you formerly had anytime, any place, anywhere, now we are tightening that for very obvious reasons. It's got to change their
It
outlook.
really is an area where stores can differentiate themselves.
Yes.
And so you can, the more liberal you are, the more likely you are to build a loyal customer base. You have to then guard against what we talked about, which are people who take advantage of that, and how much of a cost impact is it, and does it then make your costs have to be uncompetitive?
Right. And gift cards, now of course fewer people are buying the thing, they're buying the card and putting it in a box perhaps or whatever, but at least you don't have to worry about wrong size, wrong color. many of the merchants, and we've talked about this over the years too, that many merchants had changed their policies or maybe didn't even want to honor the gift card or at some reduced rate. That's yet another issue.
So a lot of issues with gift cards. The interesting thing is this. What they did is the law, I think at some point, changed on what they could do with them. So some places were charging a service fee and they were monthly cutting
Yes.
away at the value of the gift card. They can't do that. They're not supposed to do that anymore. Expiration dates. Some states allow an expiration date, but it has to be clearly stated and printed either on the card or someplace where it's known, but for most part they're forever. And then what happens if the company goes out of business? And
What happens,
well,
David?
what happens? So if the company goes into bankruptcy, you become a creditor. And so you have to get the forms, fill out the federal bankruptcy forms and send them as a creditor, and you're an unsecured creditor and you get in line with all the other creditors.
And good luck, that means very unlikely. How
Yeah.
about if you happen to buy the restaurant gift card, the restaurant went out of business, but you bought it not from the restaurant, but from Groupon or one of those kinds of, now who's on the hook for that,
That
so
would
to
be
speak?
a really good question. And I don't know how Groupon works in terms of you give Groupon money and they give you a certificate, but is it a certificate directly to the company? And what happens is, making up one, it's Red Lobster. Does that still exist?
I don't know.
I don't know either. But so we'll make up a fictional Red Lobster. And so do you get a gift card from Red Lobster or do you get a Groupon card that you can use at Red Lobster? Because that would affect what the answer to your question is.
Of course, and if you wanted to be the PR person for Groupon, you would want to make sure that your customer is satisfied or somehow made whole or
Right.
in part,
Yeah.
if not whole. On the list of who the worst is, Forever 21, which is not considered a high-end store, but not surprisingly, they are very stringent with their policy, saying you can only exchange for other items that are refunded in the store, not in the original form of payment. So even if you paid cash, you're not getting any. That's I would think that would be a very difficult one to swallow.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was telling you about that Rhode Island law that says, the law basically says if you pay in cash, they have to refund in the same
In the
form.
same form.
And I think the statute does say there are exceptions that can be made, obviously the items that I told you, in the store policy, but it's sort of like saying all sales are final. But we're saying all sales are final except that you can exchange it for something in the store. So it's sort of modifying that. It's a really stringent policy. And if it's low-end merchandise, then probably their position is just, it's too expensive for us to take things back. We're not going to do it, and we don't care if we lose you as a customer.
That's pretty much what it's saying. And the others on that list, Forever 21, Barnes & Noble, as you pointed out, because of books and
yeah,
CDs.
magazines and publications.
GameStop, Sears, once again.
GameStop would be the same thing sort of as Barnes & Noble because those are sort of like publications. I believe there would be games. And they do seem to fall into the same thing as books in some ways, except it would be different. A book you could read, put back, say I want to return it. A game usually has a wrapping to it, so they might be able to differentiate it that way. What was I cut you off?
Oh, no.
I'm interested.
You were where else should you not be shopping? Well, Sears was one, Kmart. What was the other I just said? Oh, dear.
Well, that's okay. I got a question for you. Did you get anything you wanted to return for Christmas?
No, I did not. How about you?
Well, I didn't want to return it, but I can't now. My daughters, for the first time, gave me a Christmas present, which was a drone. And so, of course, what I did is I took it outside on a very windy day, and I got it going perfectly fine, but when it was coming back from my neighbor's yard, it decided to go left instead of right, and the altitude I couldn't get to go up, so it's in the top of about a 70-foot tree.
That's
So
a
I
little bit
think
of a
it's
problem.
defective because it wouldn't go up, but I can't prove it because it's up in that tree.
That does cause problems.
Yeah.
So for people who have receipts or gift receipts these days, among the other wrinkles is that now you must have some sort of form of identification. Why?
So the gift, I don't know
The
why
gift
you'd have
card?
to have identification because no one knows who the person who bought the gift for gave it to.
Exactly.
So the
Exactly.
purpose of it makes no sense to me.
Is that is that even legal? Because somehow you're violating someone's sense of privacy. As long as I have that gift receipt that said it was purchased, there's the purchase price and the date, what right do they have? I mean, they can ask maybe,
Well,
but why would they have
Here's
that
the
right?
only thing I can think of is, do they take a copy of it or something to record who it is that returned the goods, so that if someone comes in and says it was stolen or something, they have some protection?
How
the
about
store,
your
that is.
signature?
Yeah, but you could sign
You
anybody's
could sign
name.
anyone's name. What kind of recourse is there for the stores that are Scrooge, in the sense that whatever their policy says that it is, they somehow thwart and undermine what they're supposed to be doing?
So they violate their own policies.
Yes. Is that
Yeah, that's an attorney general telephone
It
call.
is.
Yeah, I think in Massachusetts there might be an Office of Consumer Agency or something, but consumer agency, civil side of the Attorney General's office, either place, that's where I would start.
They say that it could be considered a misdemeanor.
Yeah, certainly the Rhode Island statute talks about if you don't follow the rules, it could be a misdemeanor with a fine of up to $500 or something of that nature for the store.
So if you didn't have the receipt, and they want one, you didn't have a gift receipt either, you have the gift, should you just not bother going back to the store to try to get an exchange, or should you try
I
to
would
plead your
try
case?
and see what the store has to say. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It might have been the drone itself that I got. I didn't have the receipt for it. My daughters do. I could get it from them if it hadn't landed in the tray. But the box itself had the store name that it came from marked on it. So I would assume if you brought the product back to the store and they can identify it as being something that was theirs, they might honor it.
Okay, what about fraud on the side of the consumer, who often ends up being a Scrooge? Can you imagine someone going to a store, to the pickup desk, picked it up, but then turned around, went to the other side, and cashed it in for a return without having, by the way, paid for it in the first place? Clearly fraudulent, and yet it happens.
Yeah, and that's a crime too. That's theft, larceny by fraud, if you will.
And so the store
Should
manager should prosecute them.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a terrible thing.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, how is that any different than shoplifting? Right? You take it and walk out without paying. We all know that's a crime. You take it and get a refund for it. Obviously, it should be the same.
And it's nasty, but how about people returning used merchandise like that dress?
Yeah, that's...
Is that a crime?
Yeah, of course it is. It's all part of things that drive up the cost of goods for everybody else. And yeah, it's a bad... It adds cost to the retailer doing business, and that's going to get passed along eventually.
Does it seem reasonable that stores can say, we're watching how many returns you make past 3, I don't care if you have return, gift receipt, or anything, we're not going to do it?
Yeah, see, I don't know if they can do that, but maybe if they post it as a policy,
Then they could.
might be able to.
Apparently many are. Well, thank you for tuning in to The Law Matters. We wish you many happy returns and a happy new year.